The number one drug out there in the world. It's that morning cup of coffee. The large amount of caffeine in a cup of coffee is really what's not good for you.
Today, we're looking at the fact that caffeine is more like an illegal drug than you realize.
Caffeine's just a drug.
In a delicious bean form.
No, but it's also addictive, you know, like once you're in, you're in.
Hi everyone, I'm Rabina.
And I'm Layla,
Welcome back to our channel, Elementary My Dear.
where we make nutrition science easy for you to digest.
Today we're talking about if coffee is really as bad for you as people say. First of all, what is coffee if you're not acquainted? It is a brewed drink made from roasted coffee beans. Coffee beans, they come from the coffee plant. The seeds are extracted, they're roasted, ground up, and then they're typically steeped in hot water and then filtered out to make a cup of coffee.
I'm not a huge coffee fan at all. I do not drink coffee.
You don't even like the smell of coffee.
Oh no, I don't like the smell of coffee. But you are a regular coffee drinker.
Yeah. Going to bed, I start dreaming about waking up and drinking coffee. Fun fact, worldwide, it's estimated that there's 2.25 billion cups of coffee being consumed daily.
Which isn't surprising, and if anything seems a little bit low.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, 8 billion people. Let's see, how many of those are adults?
I don't think we should do this math right
okay,
now.
well,
I don't think we know enough random facts to do this
60% of the world.
I think a lot of times when you think of coffee, you think of caffeine. But believe it or not, caffeine is only one component of coffee. In coffee, there's actually over 800 different compounds.
When we hear about all these like negative things about coffee, it's always like caffeine is a drug. This is the biggest drug that no one talks about, which is true.
It is technically true because a drug is technically defined as any chemical substance that changes your physiology or your psychology. Caffeine/coffee definitely does that. But does that automatically mean that coffee is bad for you? Let's talk about coffee in the context of 3 of the main chronic conditions that tends to be prevalent in a place like North America.
We got diabetes, we have cancer, and we have cardiovascular disease.
First up, diabetes. Coffee actually seems to reduce risk for diabetes. Research in the area actually seems to suggest a dose-dependent relationship. Every 1 cup increase per day of coffee consumption, your risk for diabetes actually goes down by 6%.
But guys, big caveat. After 8 cups of coffee a day, we do not know that relationship still exists. If you're drinking more than 8 cups of coffee a day, we don't know what happens. What's really interesting about that specific study, it was a meta-analysis of all the research that's been done on coffee consumption and diabetes, is that this is basically the same for both caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee, which shows that potentially in this relationship, it might not be caffeine as a mediator of this effect, but it also shows that caffeine is not detrimental to health.
What's also interesting is that when you look at changes in habit in coffee consumption, when people increase their consumption of coffee over time, that seems to reduce your risk for type 2 diabetes by 11%, whereas decreasing your intake of coffee actually increases your risk for diabetes.
It's hard to kind of like parse out exactly what's happening because these are observational studies of large groups of people, but it seems pretty consistent that we see a dose-dependent response. So the more coffee someone drinks, up to 8 cups a day, the less diabetes risk that they have, and changes over time leads to either an increase or decrease in diabetes risk based on whether or not you're increasing your coffee consumption or decreasing it. It seems pretty compelling that coffee does have a beneficial effect on decreasing diabetes risk.
So we talk about cancer. There's actually quite a bit of research on coffee consumption and cancer. Coffee consumption does seem to reduce risk for skin, oral, pharynx, liver, colon, and endometrial cancer. On the other hand, it seems to increase risk for lung cancer.
They actually think that the reason for that is that in a lot of cultures, coffee consumption is often accompanied with cigarette smoking. Some newer research does show that the association for lung cancer, when it's controlled for tobacco use and cigarette use, that relationship tends to go away. That being said, caffeine on its own actually does increase the risk of bladder and ovarian cancer. What's interesting there is that coffee has caffeine, but when we're looking at coffee as a whole, it doesn't increase the risk of these cancers, but the caffeine individually does. So that shows that there might be actually like a protective effect of some of those other components on those cancers, or potentially maybe some of those other sources of caffeine like energy drinks or pop. Maybe those have components that would increase your risk for those specific types of cancer. So it's kind of hard to parse out these little nuances, but as a whole, coffee, caffeine included, tends to be protective or neutral for most cancers.
Now let's talk about cardiovascular disease or heart disease. There seems to be a non-linear relationship between coffee consumption and risk for cardiovascular disease. 3.5 cups a day seems to be associated with the least amount of risk, whereas at 5 cups a day, it seems like the risk is about the same as non-drinkers.
You might think, okay, well, with diabetes, the more that you have, the more of a beneficial effect we see. Why is it not the same with cardiovascular disease? A lot of it has to do with the caffeine content of coffee, because caffeine is a stimulant. This can cause increases in blood pressure and increases in heart rate. Those things can cause more compounded plaque in your arteries that can lead to things like heart attack and stroke. Additionally, it can just put extra strain on your cardiovascular system.
You might be wondering, how might coffee do all of these wonderful things?
Having a plausible mechanism is very important when we're looking at this kind of research, because you might find associations between things, but if there's no possible way for it to work, then it's probably a false correlation or something like that.
One of the things that we've observed about coffee is that it's actually quite rich in antioxidants. Caffeine is actually an antioxidant in and of itself. There's also lignans, which is a type of polyphenols, and flavonoids, as well as other types of antioxidants that might be implicated in things like diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular disease.
A lot of the compounds in coffee don't just come from the actual plant itself. There's a lot of different compounds that are produced during the roasting and preparation of coffee that may also have beneficial effects and antioxidant-like effects.
That being said, there's been a lot of research on caffeine specifically. Caffeine seems to help reduce the absorption of glucose in the intestines, reduces gluconeogenesis, as well as reduces glycogenolysis, which all three together basically means that the blood glucose levels are kind of attenuated, which seems to be a possible mechanism for why there might be the reduced risk for diabetes that's associated with coffee consumption.
One of the other mechanisms that is kind of intuitive, but I didn't even think of until I read it in one of the articles, is that coffee actually displaces some of the other drinks that people might have that contain caffeine, or even other drinks that people might have that have higher amounts of energy, as well as some of the other nutrients that we would recommend that people limit. This is things like soft drinks or potentially even juice and things like that. And while people might put sugar in their coffee, the amount of sugar in a coffee versus the amount of sugar in, let's say, a Coke is much less.
What's also fascinating is that coffee consumption increases thermogenesis, which means that your metabolism is slightly higher. So drinking up to 6 cups of coffee a day actually increases your calorie needs by about 100 calories a day.
The mechanism of that is most likely through the caffeine in coffee, because it is a stimulant, so it gets things going a little faster. And honestly, in the grand scheme of things, 100 calories a day isn't that much, but over the course of a lifetime, that could be a significant amount.
On top of that, coffee is actually kind of an appetite suppressant. It increases your satiety. Perhaps the slightly increased metabolism, along with possibly lower intake of other foods and beverages throughout the day, together results in kind of an impact there.
Coffee is actually known to reduce inflammation, oxidative stress, which we know are both correlated with cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. There's actually a study done where they took regular coffee drinkers and they said to one group, stop drinking coffee, and another group of them they said, drink 8 cups of coffee a day, which is quite a bit. They found that certain measures of inflammation decrease. It had no effect on some of the other markers of inflammation, but it also decreased some of the markers of oxidative stress.
And the study was only a duration of 4 weeks. Even though it was 8 cups a day, I'm curious if, even if you were to drink less than that, if the cumulative effect over the course of your life, if you'd see similar positive impacts. Coffee has polyphenols, and some polyphenols actually act as a prebiotic. It has been shown that coffee consumption seems to help improve the diversity of people's microbiome.
We know very little about the microbiome, and there's more and more coming out all the time, but there is a large body of research that's showing that the microbiome may be involved in the development of certain chronic diseases.
So all in all, it seems like coffee is not as bad as people seem to think it is. Unless you're drinking like a frappuccino with like whipped cream and stuff. Like, I don't know where the hate's coming from. I love my coffee.
And I will also say on that note about the Starbucks Frappuccino is that this research was not done specifically in like a Starbucks Frappuccino or a venti like pumpkin spice latte. Like honestly it could be because it was a lot of observational research, but when we're looking at the entire food matrix of something, I would say that potentially a Frappuccino, the balance of like, you know, is this going to be cardioprotective or diabetes protective may not be there. So if you're going to have a Frappuccino, I would not say I'm having this Frappuccino because I'm trying to prevent diabetes specifically. Have the Frappuccino because you like Frappuccinos. But if you're having a good old cup of joe, don't feel bad about it because you actually might be helping your health.
Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, and follow us on our Instagram and TikTok.
Comment below what your favorite type of coffee is. And tell me what I should try. Maybe if you guys can convince me to like coffee, I'll be eternally grateful. And so will my heart and my pancreas.
Thank you for watching.
Bye.
Bye.